They also knew all along that ultimately it was going to fail, but it was a great business decision to do so because it allowed them to keep, printing money almost unimpacted by the GDPR for at least the last, going on 5 years. If you ask up front, as does Apple's ATT, do you consent to having your behavior or your data tracked and collected? Naturally, very, very few people are going to agree to that because you don't have any idea of what you're agreeing to, right? And more importantly, you don't have any good idea what benefit you're going to get in return, right? So I've always tried to tell people not to have the pop-up be the first thing that happens. The real GDPR is a global data privacy revolution.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, Tim Walters. He is a very well-known strategist, analyst, advisor and speaker covering the intersection of data privacy, customer experience and marketing strategy. So he is an ideal guest for this podcast, and I'm very happy to have him around. He is currently privacy lead at Content Advisory and founder of Zero Theory. He previously founded the Digital Clarity Group, and he was also a senior analyst at Forrester Research. But what I really love are the titles of some of his keynotes and publications, including The Total Impossibility of Customer Experience Management, Data Privacy Goes Mainstream, An Unexpected Opportunity for Customer Experience, and Trust is Imperative in the Customer Experience Era. With all this said, let's get started. Tim, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sergio.
And look, we've never met, but we share these environments or these fora, where we keep, or at least from my point of view, we're trying to redo the internet and sort of reinvent the relationship between platforms, people, publishers, advertisers. And I've tried and I've failed many times at doing this, and I wonder about your perspective. And perhaps, these days there's a good way to get into this, which is the Facebook and Instagram, the Meta case, right? So if the contractual legal basis is not allowed and consent has to be used at every level, even within within these platforms, where does it lead, in your opinion? What's your perspective, if you have any already, because it's very recent?
Yeah, I certainly have some opinions about it. I'm not so sure whether those opinions are well-founded. But I wrote a longish thread about it on Twitter just yesterday, in fact.
I'll look it up.
But what I have not done is read the opinions themselves, or the documents that were released, I guess, just yesterday, explaining EDPB's position and so forth. But I go way back on this because I somehow ended up at a meeting between big brands and data controllers like Facebook, Google, big telcos, Deutsche Telekom, in Madrid between those kinds of people, data controllers, and a bunch of DPAs who, for some reason, decided to travel to Madrid and meet with these guys. And at a cocktail reception during that event, I was talking to one of the representatives from Facebook, and I was basically saying, "How are you guys going to go about, acquiring consent
Yeah.
for the data processing?" And the guy just looked at me very calmly and said, "We won't have to." And I
Yeah.
said, "Well, what do you mean? Clearly you need to." And he said, "No, we just won't have to. We don't need consent." And I was kind of dumbfounded, but looking back on it, it was clear that they knew already then that they were going to use the contractual basis.
Yeah.
That was going to be their so-called strategy for so-called compliance with the GDPR. And
Mm.
when that became evident to me, then I was even more dumbfounded because in my various work on the GDPR, and I'm certainly not a legal expert and not a technical expert either, but I deal with a lot of marketers, and I was trying to advise marketers and software vendors about what the impact might be on them. And I had, for some reason, dug up a Article 29 Working Party
Mm.
opinion from 2014.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And it was, I don't know if it was only about the contractual necessity, but there was a large section about that. And they very clearly said that contractual necessity could not be used to legitimate tracking for behavioral advertising.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I believe
And
that opinion, sorry to interrupt you briefly, but I believe that's the opinion on legitimate interest because it's the latest thing we've
yeah,
got really from what now is ADPB. And it talked a lot about contractual and yeah,
right. It
yeah,
could be. It could very well be because I was also trying to figure out legitimate interest at that time. And then, of course, that key passage from the 2014 WP29 opinion was cited, quoted again in the 2019 October 2019 guidance that was put out by the EDPB. So, and by the way, the draft version of that 2019 guidance came out in April of 2018 before the GDPR went into effect. So my position is that um, Facebook Meta certainly knew in October 2019 that certainly knew in October 2019, could have safely assumed in April of 2018, and with a little bit of digging, could have found out in 2014 that they were going to end up where they are today. That is, that somehow it was going to be established that contractual necessity could not be used in the way they were going to use it. And secondly, and I think importantly, that, and this is a little perhaps more controversial, or maybe I'm just ill-informed, but my feeling is that given the, what is it called? The cooperation requirements between the national DPAs that are built into the GDPR, they could also have known that they wouldn't be able to hide behind the cooperative Irish Data Protection Authority or Data Protection Commission forever. That was also going to have to end at some point. And so to sum it up, my view is that not only did Facebook know all along that they were going to use this basis, they also knew all along that ultimately it was going to fail. But it was a great business decision to do so because it allowed them to keep, printing money almost unimpacted by the GDPR for at least the last, going on 5 years.
The scenario that we are looking at now, which yeah, according to your analysis, which seems pretty accurate, should have been the one we had from the outset, means that we need consent within the platform. So up to now, there's been a complaint from the sort of digital marketing community that first-party data seem to be protected because within the realm of your digital properties, you had your rules and people abide by these rules and they understand it's a free service and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so now even that data, which is considered again first party, and therefore you do not need a broker to sort of gather consent on your behalf, as it happens with
Mm-hmm.
news
Mm-hmm.
publishers. Now it's not that safe any longer because you will be subject to sort of the sample size limitations that come with asking properly. So if that's the case, I guess a few potential consequences. One of them, let's see what you think. I mean, is it a good thing that we end up with the same consent pop-ups that we suffer throughout the web within these platforms?
I don't know if that's a good outcome, but I think that it's clearly better than having people effectively forced to consent under contractual necessity.
Okay, so assuming that everything moves into consent, if you ask properly, and it really is a question of accepting versus rejecting properly, again, as per, for example, the CNIL's enforcement of e-privacy in France against Microsoft recently, if that is the case, all of the studies point towards very low acceptance rates, and therefore Facebook, Instagram would not be able to really do the same kind of targeting. Is that leading to a better world in your perspective?
Well, I was listening to the podcast that you did with I think his name was Peter Hansa.
Yeah.
Right, the German
Peter Hansa, yeah,
legal expert, right? And you were talking a lot about consent pop-ups and consent management, right? Consent management software.
Yeah.
And I have long been an advocate of something that I think he also endorsed, if I'm remembering correctly, and that is so-called contextual or just-in-time consent request.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you ask up front,
yeah,
as does Apple's ATT, do you consent to having your behavior or your data tracked and collected? Naturally, very, very few people are going to agree to that because you don't have any idea of what you're agreeing to, right? And more importantly, you don't have any good idea what benefit you're going to get in return.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I've always tried to tell people not to have the pop-up be the first thing that happens when somebody arrives at your site or other property, but usually a site. Because one, they're in no position to make a decision, a reasonable decision, right? And secondly, it typically that the consent pop-up is off-brand. I mean, it's the worst possible thing that you could have as the first experience in what is supposed to be your great customer experiences.
Agreed. Yeah.
So if I don't know whether just-in-time consent would be any better, but at least you would then be in a position where you know what you're getting in return. So if I come to your site and I start shopping around and I put something into a shopping cart, then there's a request saying, hey, would you like us to drop a cookie onto your browser to preserve the status of your shopping cart against your sessions, right? I said, well, yeah, that makes sense because I want to preserve my shopping cart, right? And so it's these, then I can understand what the trade-off is, and I can understand exactly exactly what you're asking for and exactly why you're asking for it, rather than something that pops up that says, we use cookies to enhance your experience. Do you agree or disagree?
So if we were to apply this to targeted advertising, I guess we could be presented with an ad that is not targeted. So therefore, from a company that can afford to spray and pray, right? So a P&G, Unilever, some sort of generic, soap or perfume or car. And then next to it, say, would you prefer to see this? Or if you consent to your interests being used in order to filter out, advertisers, then we will be tapping into, a wider range of direct-to-consumer services. Therefore, here you have, like super organic, product that is so small they cannot afford to target everybody. Do you think we can get to something like that where people can have a say in, okay, I'm sharing this information which is, for example, my interests. Because if I do, I will not be supporting this, for example, to be extreme, highly polluting, corporation. And instead,
Right.
I'll be supporting, a direct to consumer, which is a mom and pop store.
Right. Yeah. Again, that makes sense in theory, but then the question I think which would be your question, not only does that scale, but it doesn't scale, right? You
Exactly.
know that it doesn't, all right? Because we're imagining a kind of fairly, you know, nuanced, not complicated, but nuanced exchange, right?
Yeah.
Where you're making a proposition to me and trying to anticipate what benefits I'm going to be most likely to positively respond to, and so on and so forth. And that's good when it's you talking to me, but it's not good when it's
Yeah.
advertisers talking to hundreds of millions of people.
You're right. You're right. Okay. So, I was thinking, because we've both been sort of witnessing the evolution of these intent casting, the idea of intent casting, or agency, and perhaps the dream of one day letting people declare their needs and interests, and then having brands adjust their offerings and adapt to them. Perhaps there is an angle here where I don't think Facebook would ever do it, or Meta, because they're not, I don't think they have the mindset. But do you think there is an angle where Instagram, for example, I think much more than Facebook, turns around and says, okay, I want to use the contractual legal basis. To do that, I need to make advertising the core offering.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
discovering things not from, retailers, but from your friends, sort of an accessory to it. Therefore, it is your friends and your network that needs to go around the algorithm, or, the feed, to ensure they reach me. Because in the end, the core purpose of the platform is to be some sort of private shopping tool, where I
Mm-hmm.
discover things on the basis of what I need, where I expose, which of course
Mm-hmm.
there will be the complex task of differentiating demand generation from, demand satisfaction. So how much do
Yep.
you know what you really need? But if I am on Instagram and I don't like any of these platforms, but if I were to be a heavy Instagram user, and I were to consider it a place to discover things that I may want to buy, and that was the core proposition, do you think that would fly?
It seems like it would. I mean, I'm not really in a position to judge it, but I can imagine, and I'm certainly willing to grant that you could craft a service or a business proposition, a service proposition that would allow you to use the contractual basis, right? Because, for example, as you're saying, in a shopping situation, you're entering this bazaar, okay, this online bazaar, and the purpose of entering the bazaar is for you to purchase things. And in order for you to purchase things, or in order for us to direct to assist you and make the most relevant kind of pathway for you, or most relevant offerings, we need to know what you are looking for. And so that would seem to fit into a contractual basis, and that would be fine, all right. But the thing that I was objecting to yesterday was in my Twitter thread, was that Ben Thompson, the amazing Ben Thompson, who I admired tremendously, um, he was arguing in his daily update, as he says, his daily column yesterday, if I'm representing it correctly, that because Facebook, that is not Meta, but Facebook, the social platform, is offering personalized social networking services. Why not? Why shouldn't they also be allowed to offer then personalized advertising services? And as he said at one point, it's serving you an article that the algorithm determines you might be interested in is no different than serving you an ad that the algorithm determines you might be interested in. They're all just bits, right? And yeah, that makes sense, but I object to the notion that because we have a social network that, for good reasons, historically has developed into developed personalized features, it doesn't immediately follow that we can then claim that personalized advertising is an essential part of that service. It's essentially similar, but it's not an essential part of that service. So, for example, in the when was it? In 2019, I think. I mean, we started with the recent findings against Meta or about Meta, and that all started, of course, with a complaint by Max Schrems and NOYB on May 25th, 2018. On the morning of May 25th, when the GDPR went into effect, they filed that complaint, or whatever it's called, and a number of others, right? I think also against Google and some others. And that went, at some point, that was the subject of a court case in Austria, right, where they filed it. And in conjunction with that, there was some surveying done of Austrian citizens, Austrian users of Facebook, and something like, if I'm recalling it all correctly, 10% said that they even suspected, even had any inkling that they had entered into a contractual agreement with Facebook by accepting the terms and service from 25 May. And only about 15 or 20% of that 10% said that they agreed that Facebook had a contractual obligation to serve them personalized advertising, right? In other words, it's clearly not understood and accepted that it's part of the service.
Yeah, I agree. It's always been a very sneaky approach to things. I think we all agree, or most of us agree on that. And I did put a lot of faith into the GDPR back in the day. Do you think, to cut it short, do you think we have an enforcement issue, or do you think we have a much deeper problem in terms of how regulation really works? Or do you think that just agency, transparency, control are not really attainable?
Wow. Well, I guess I want to say, first of all, clearly we have an enforcement problem, but that, because in my view, and perhaps in your view as well, it's not being enforced very effectively, or it's not being enforced as aggressively as I would like. But that might be just an expression of my naivete about the difficulties and intricacies of enforcement. I mean, I've always had this kind of simplistic view that once you establish that something like, let's say, pre-checked, pre-checked opt-in boxes on a consent request are non-compliant, then you ought to be able, as a DPA, you ought to be able to just effectively start issuing parking tickets or speeding tickets. That, we've stated that pre-check boxes are not allowed. You're using them. Here's your fine. We don't need to do a 6-month investigation. We don't need to write a 200-page report that's going to stand up to appeal. You're fined because you broke the law. But then on the other hand, I don't want to say that transparency and control, if those are the words you were using, are unattainable.
Yeah.
And this gets to kind of my hobby horse, as we say. As I noted, I'm addressing marketers, customer experience teams. And my advice is, it's kind of an unnecessarily cute turn of phrase, but my advice is, don't worry about the GDPR, right? The EU regulation, or anybody or any other regulation. You guys don't worry about the CCPA or the CPRA or the new New York legislation that's just been introduced that's very GDPR-like, so on and so forth. Don't worry about it. You guys need to, because somebody somebody much more informed than you will tell you what you can and cannot do. Okay? Rather, I want you as marketers to worry about what I call the real GDPR, The real GDPR is a global data privacy revolution. And that real GDPR is powered by and founded in consumer anxiety and anger about data use and abuse. So what marketers should be focused on is satisfying not the regulators, but satisfying the consumers. And what does then the question is, doesn't that mean that there's going to be a kind of, if not civil war, at least misdirection within every organization, because the legal team is going to be trying to be compliant with the GDPR and the marketers are off doing something else? Well, no, because what is it that consumers want? Every survey all around the world, every year, every demographic, in so many words, one way or another, says people want control of their data. They want to feel like they know what's going on with it and they can control it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, or not exactly on the other hand, but my favorite line from the GDPR is right at the beginning, I think in recital 5, right in the beginning. And it says something like, data subjects should have control of their own personal data. Now, that's 10 words, okay? You can make it 8 words because data subjects are people and their own personal data is redundant. So people should have control of their personal data. And I call that the prime directive of the GDPR. I even have an argument that if you properly understand those 8 words, you understand the entirety of the GDPR. You understand all of your obligations under the GDPR, right? And so, in other words, there's not a civil war or a misdirection between the legal effort to satisfy the regulators and the marketing effort or customer experience effort to satisfy consumers, because the goal is the same: to put people in control of their personal data.
Why does it never end? Why is it that on the marketing side, or let's say more precisely, on the marketing technology side, the one thing that every quarter keeps on selling, it never ends, is the dream of scientific measurement of intent, and sort of the very idea of attribution, the very idea of let's say predictable revenue, to take it to the extreme. It keeps selling. It's like the 21st century alchemists. Why do you think that is? Why is it that despite all the things that we see, the very human limitations that we face when we deal with consumers and what we as consumers, explore, why is it that then when you get to the other side of the table, the one thing that constantly sells very easily is, look, if you install this, if you measure these touch points, you will know when people are going to buy. You will know which channels will work best. You will know where you're wasting your money. Why is it that still today, nobody has learned the lesson?
Yeah. Well, I don't have an answer to that, but it is certainly the perennial problem. I mean, years ago, I've toyed with the idea of, as a kind of a business giveaway, right, after my presentations or whatever, to give people not a USB stick or an umbrella with my brand on it or something, but give them a pocket mirror. And because I wanted to say, look, every one of you is a consumer. Every one of you understands the anxiety and the anger about data misuse. And then you go to work and you do exactly that thing that angers you, right? So just keep looking in the mirror. But
I like that a lot, saying, look, you're not just, this sort of, soulless entity. Just look at the mirror, put a circle around, and here's a consumer. Yeah. It's you.
Yeah. But to be a little more fair, I think it's because businesses still are, there's been a lot of talk about agile businesses, not only as a software development, but as a management practice, as a business cultural practice. But we don't see a lot of evidence of it yet. That is, businesses are still intended to be are considered to be successful, and maybe arguably, in order to be successful, have to institute predictable, repeatable processes and efficient processes. And that's okay, fine, all right? I leave that aside, but that's a fact of life. And that is a fact of life for marketers as well, right? They've got as many KPIs to aim at as every other part of the business, as the factory floor does. And I think that there's a deep, if not fundamental, and hopefully not irreconcilable tension between that yearning or demand for predictability and kind of scientific, or not scientific, at least mechanical reproduction of results. Versus the messiness of human relationships if you are truly embracing customer centricity, right? When you're truly embracing customer centricity in a certain way, you're going in the opposite direction. You're saying, we're going to have conversations with people. We're not going to try to we're not going to enter into relationship with them thinking that in the next 5 steps we have to get their money. We're going to enter into a relationship, having a conversation with them and seeing how we can make their lives better. And that's just messy and emotional and psychological, and it's not efficient and repeatable and predictable.
No, it's not Cartesian. It breaks, it runs against our very, at the same time, human need to have an explanation for everything. So I like that sort of fight. So there's another theory here, which is that CFOs have taken over. I've heard a few people saying this.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, another way of looking at it is certainly not an alternative way, but another aspect of it is that if you say, okay, if you embrace the notion that we're after obviously the most positive business outcomes we can possibly achieve, then I mean, almost everybody now agrees that you're not competing by, product features and benefits. You're not competing by speeds and feeds. You're competing in the realm of customer experience. Now, that's been established for a while. So customer experience is what matters.
Yeah.
But now we're, post GDPR or in this regulatory environment, we're in an era of what I call beg data, BEG, right? Because you need to try to get permission, right?
Yeah.
To use people's data.
Yeah.
Then the question is, what makes people more likely to let us use their data? And in the surveys, including surveys that were done by the DMA, right, in the UK, the Digital Marketing Association, who has a vested interest, like the IAB, in getting their hands on as much data as possible. The surveys show that the overwhelming number one response when you ask people what would make you happy to share your data, not just what would make you willing, what would make you happy to share your data with a company, the number one answer is trust. If I trust the company.
Yeah.
So trust is imperative for fueling customer experiences, which are imperative for business outcomes. So even if in other words, even if you focus on the business outcomes like the CFO tends to do, in my view, you can only get there by looping back through, or let's say it's unavoidable to loop back through this kind of messy human stuff in which you're trying to encourage and nurture trust and trustworthiness, right? And demonstrating that you are trustworthy so that people will be willing to share the data that you must have in order to build the experiences, which are the key to competing for the business outcomes.
That's a really good summary, Tim. Thank you. I think we can leave it at this because we run out of time, but this is very interesting. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sergio.
Thank you. Okay, that's all for today. And you will find some episode notes and links to our social channels on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.